and welcome to GreenFleet Talks. My name's Kate Armitage and I'm your host for our discussion today, and I'm delighted to be joined by Darren Gardner, Commercial Director at Zaptech.
Hello, Kate.
Hi, Darren. Nice to meet you. Thanks for joining us. Darren, Zaptech is a well-known brand to EV owners in Norway, but can you tell me a little bit more about the company and your plans for the UK?
We certainly can. It's great to be here. Thank you, Kate. And yes, you're right. Norway is our home market where Zaptech is based. And if you're a homeowner in Norway, it's likely that you've probably got one of our electric vehicle charging points at home. We're the #1 provider of electric vehicle infrastructure in Norway. And over the last few years, we've expanded into the rest of Scandinavia too. And we are now in Switzerland. This year we've started in the UK and Germany and Sweden and France and a few more countries to come in 2022 as well. So we're really going for it in internationally. But you're right, Germany is one of the is probably the biggest market for EVs. UK, huge growth in both of those markets, but #1 in terms of number of charging points, etc., is Norway. So we bring all of that kind of Norwegian heritage in terms of design and software engineering and capability and skills and people and understanding of customers, and now we bring that into our new markets. And we're really excited that we are now here in the UK as of, I think we started in about April of this year. So here we are, and the only way is up, to quote a well-known song.
Great news, Darren. And we often look at Norway because it is such an early market and it's been so tremendously successful. So it's great to see Zaptech becoming this pan-European brand. Today, Darren, you and I are discussing the importance that transport plays, both globally and in the UK as we push towards net zero. And we'll be looking at how Zaptech can play an important role in this transition. With that in mind, COP26 has just ended, and we saw a number of pledges that have been made regarding the phase out of ICE vehicles. Do you think COP26 went far enough, or what more would you have liked to have seen?
I'd like to have seen China turn up. That would have been good. I would like to have seen the complete phase out of coal rather than the phase down, but there we go. That would have been good. In terms of the electrification of transport, it's complicated, and getting consensus across over 200 countries is always going to be difficult. So there has to be a balance to this. The purist in me and the Greta Thunberg, if you like, in me says, no, it's not fast enough, it's not quick enough, it's not bold enough, we must go quicker. But we do have a consensus that governments have said by 2040, we will go for all, zero emission vehicles 100% by 2040 and 2035 in mature markets. That probably is just a reality. We can go a little bit quicker in the UK 2030 because every country's starting point is different. But also there's the balance that's needed, that it's not just about the environment, it's not just about technology, but to do these things, that is also about economics. And for countries across the world, that there will be different skill sets, different commercial models, different levels of funding, both from private sector and from the government. And so I think with my balanced hat on, that takes a bit of society, a bit of economics, a bit of environmental. I think with that in mind, it probably is the only date that people could realistically work towards. So at least we have a date, at least we have 2040 or 2035. And then obviously the devil is in the detail.
It is, and it's worth. I think it's worth remembering, because this does get kind of forgotten, that 2040 is for cars and vans. So we've still got some rather nasty transport problems that are going to be super challenging. And for my two penneth, India their bigger pledge was around being net zero by 2070, which was a bit alarming. And then I thought, well, maybe they're being honest, maybe they're being realistic, and that it is an emerging country and they're going to need help. And maybe the Western world, the developed Western world, needs to do more to pledge to support the emerging countries, because how can we expect them to follow the same timelines as us? We know they have to, but
that's right. And I think the lens in which all countries see the world through is not through climate change; it's through economic growth, it's through gross value added. And India and other emerging countries will be thinking about their own GDP, their own economic growth, and they are, and India still is, dependent on some fossil fuels to keep the lights on and the economy ticking over. And that, before I think people like me and countries like us get on our high horse about going too far, it's not far enough and it's not quick enough. For the rights or wrongs of that, the lens in which we see the world is through economic growth, not through climate change and sustainability, as much as I would like that to be different. And so, I can understand India's, when you see it through that lens, that, 2070, yes, it might be honest, but also in their view is trying to get, well, it's sustainability in its truest form, isn't it? It's climate change and economic growth and health and all of those things. With all of that in mind, it's probably not a bad outcome at all. At least there is a date that most countries are, united on.
Let's zoom the conversation right back in closer to home. What is Zaptec doing as a business and with your employees to support achieving net zero targets?
Yeah, we're, I suppose in truth, the answer is that because we're a startup in the UK, that we haven't quite figured that out. And I know that as we are setting up our supply chains, but we are both thinking about the distribution of our hardware, both, sometimes it comes from Norway, and even when we have stock holding in the UK, there are still emissions from the transportation of those, for example, to our customers. So is there a way that, that's the question that we are asking ourselves at the moment, is how do we make that carbon neutral, at least? And in truth, Kate, right now I couldn't tell you how we do that. But from our own sort of perspective, at least we have, we all drive electric vehicles, and that's probably all we can say at the moment. We don't have any offices. We work from home.
Wow.
And so we're keeping our consumption to a minimum in terms of energy consumption and the like. And we're doing all of the things that any modern business now is doing in terms of Zoom calls and keeping transport to a minimum. And yeah, I think the biggest challenge for us is the logistics and supply chain. And ask me the question in 2 months. 2 months, Kate.
Well, I absolutely will. I'll come back to you. But also my next question, potentially, if you can solve the next question, then you may find your supplier who'll deliver your units. So in terms of Zaptec supporting private businesses and public sector organisations, what are you doing to help them become net zero?
I suppose the biggest thing is that we manufacture electric vehicle charging points that help them transition to a electric fleet. And without the charging points, without the vehicles, you can't do that, amongst other things. And so that's our little bit in the value chain, is that we make really great charging points for people to charge at home, at work, and in some destination places where there's a longer dwell time. So we make really good charging points, and we've got a really great portal that helps businesses manage their sort of consumption and monitor assets and all those sorts of things. And we are now integrating with quite a few third parties to basically do some things. For example, if you're at home, you want to be able to charge your vehicle when it's cheapest, but also cleanest on the grid. And also, if you've got some solar panels on your roof, you want to be able to integrate your solar PV system into your charging infrastructure at home or at work. So yes, we make really great kit, but we do some really cool things in terms of software and integrating that with other third-party applications to help customers choose, when is the greenest time to choose. So that's really important. But also, one of the challenges that businesses say is that, I want my fleet to charge at home, at work, and on the go. And it's a nightmare for fleet managers to be able to separate what's personal charging and what's business charging, and how do you do all the billing and reconciliation of all of that. And so we've been working, and I hope I'm okay to name drop, but working with a really great organization called Mina Energy, they're the clever people who are able to do this. But we make our hardware compatible with their software. And so they're the sorts of things that we're doing. So yes, we provide great hardware, but we're also trying to make that accessible to the right software people, so that businesses and homeowners and renters can choose when it's best for them to charge their vehicles, when it's cheapest or greenest or both.
And Darren, this is, my background is energy and EV charging infrastructure, so I get a little bit boring about all of this. But it's having a great product, a recharging product that makes it easier for fleets to switch to electric, because it's affordable, because you can do it at home or work, or destinations. But your second point, which is having made the decision to switch to an electric vehicle, you have to make sure that you are using the right electricity. And when I say right, that it's ideally renewable, or it's being the electricity is coming at a time when the grid isn't using coal, or indeed everyone switching on their EV means that a coal-fired power station has to be turned on, which is the kind of nightmare scenario, really, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, and I personally don't see the e-mobility world as separate to the energy world, and it's all part of the same ecosystem. And I think what really excites me, and maybe Zaptec will get into this at some point, but certainly demand side management is part of the mix. At the moment, vehicle to grid is still a long way off. I mean, I was involved in some V2G trials a year or 2 years ago with Nissan and my previous employer, and that also feels to me part of enabling the transition to net zero. Is you've got all of these spare kilowatt hours in your battery, and you've got a fleet of vans parked up at those peak hours, and instead of turning on those fossil-based peaking plants to generate the extra power that we need, can we do something more interesting? And so that's, I think, the challenge for manufacturers, not just Zaptec, is how do we see ourselves as part of that wider energy system that ultimately means that we don't need these coal things anymore.
Absolutely, and in that context, you have an opportunity to tackle net zero from two completely different lenses, one from a transport lens, but other from a helping support the transition to renewable energy as well, through things like vehicle to grid, which, yes, it is still emerging and developing, but it will come, and it'll come sooner than we think, if my experience of the transition to EVs is anything to go by. I think the latest stats from SMMT for November showed that electric vehicles made up battery electric vehicles made up something like 15% of all new car sales, which is great news. And I kind of do a little mini Mexican wave every time I hear this, and then I immediately get depressed, because it means that 85% still chose to buy either an ICE or a plug-in hybrid vehicle. So what do you think is putting businesses off from purchasing electric vehicles at this time?
I'm a glass half full man, so I love seeing those SMMT stats each month, and even the plug-in hybrid numbers still give me cause for cheer, because at least it's a little bit And I think for those plug-in hybrid drivers, you know, those I think I don't know what the latest stat was, but something like 51% of all new vehicle sales are purchased by fleets and businesses.
Yep.
And that to me shows that there are still some company car drivers who are saying, I still need a 500-mile range, even though their kind of average trip is perhaps only 150 miles up and down a motorway. So I think there's still a little bit of nervousness about that, but I don't think so. I think if I look at a lot of companies that I speak to, they've begun to electrify their fleet already. Cars are the quick wins, company cars, and so I see lots of companies going to an all-electric policy, and also then creating things like salary sacrifice schemes for non-company car drivers and their families, so they too can benefit from some of the tax advantages of having an electric car. So I think some of it's a timing thing that companies are setting up these sorts of programs. I think the one of the big challenges is vans, is like commercial vehicles. There's less availability. People have not quite worked out the payloading of those vehicles and what is the true range. And there's just a little bit more work to do. And I think some of the leases, for example, are a little bit longer than the cars. And so if you want to get to let's say all electric fleet, including vans, by 2030, then you've got to really sort of start to electrify, particularly from a van point of view, probably between now and no later than, let's say, 2026, if you've got a 4-year lease. So that doesn't give you a lot of time to work out things like payloading. Then how do I deal with reimbursement of expenses? If I want my van to charge at home and on the go. And then there are so many complicated issues around, if I charge at home, is that a benefit in kind? Yeah. There are payroll, HR type, trade union type things that companies have to work through. So it's not just a simple question of, look, there's this choice of vehicle or this type of car that you can choose from, and then there's these great incentives in terms of tax or grants and those sorts of things, and and the grid infrastructure. They're obvious challenges, but there are subtle things behind the background, in the background, that companies are facing about, how does this affect my people? What's the tax position? How do I fund this? All those sorts of things, they just take time to work out. And I think it's just a timing thing. And I'm encouraged by the SMMT data. And I reckon, I don't know, here's my 18 months are, shall I say it? I reckon BEVs and petrol neck and neck.
Okay, I like that. That's I was going to say that's pretty ambitious, because at the moment we're comparing BEVs to diesel, but of course that's because diesel is collapsing. Petrol's holding up slightly better, albeit the chip shortage isn't helping the sales figures.
No. But, and I think what will also help is the second-hand market as well. There isn't really one at the moment, and so fast forward 18 months, 2 years, perhaps a lot of companies or even individual drivers will also look at second-hand EVs as well.
I think, actually, in terms of why businesses aren't going electric, we must remember that a lot of businesses rely on the second-hand van market, certainly smaller businesses. That market definitely doesn't exist, because you may pick up the odd small van, EMV 200 or a Kangoo, but nothing like the new generation of larger vans. So that's a good point. And then so my last question for you, Darren. So we know that the UK has a target to ban sales of ICE cars and vans by 2030. That will happen. I think that's a given. What more can the UK do to lead the way with the demonstration of EV charging infrastructure or with vehicle technology and government legislation?
Well, I mean, I come from an energy background, and so I see that in the insulation world, if you want to deal with fuel poverty, you put an obligation on an energy company that says if you don't reduce your CO2 emissions by a certain amount and do that through these types of measures, be that insulation or new boilers, then you're fined potentially 10% of your worldwide turnover. So then what that means is that energy companies, just bear with me on this, but energy companies then think, okay, to spend 500 million on insulating people's homes each, let's say 500 million on energy efficiency measures for those that really need it, is actually cheaper than potentially being fined tens of billions of pounds or euros or whatever. And so I'm not suggesting that the government potentially slap another obligation on the energy companies, because that ultimately then impacts people's bills and they're still high enough. But I wonder if there is a role within the automotive industry, for example, that there is an obligation on the vehicle manufacturers to say, that government, this government says, well, in the same way, that they perhaps part fund or fully fund home charging, for example, or in certain demographics or in certain postcode areas, or and what you don't want is VW or BMW funding my charging point, as a higher tax rate payer. You don't want that. But is there something that that either through obligation or through industry organising itself, that says actually we have a responsibility to roll out the infrastructure, something like that? I mean, I think I've seen that work in energy efficiency.
Yeah.
And of course, the other measures that we know, don't we? And we've already got them. We've got 1% benefit in kind and company car tax. We've got grants, and we've got plenty of funders, private investors who will fund projects, and so there isn't really a shortage of money or incentives or grants to get sort of say DC assets out there, is there, what else could we do? I think that was your question.
Yeah.
Well, maybe that's my 10 pence worth, is slap an obligation on somebody.
Darren, I've never heard anyone suggest that, and I think it's got legs. I like it.
Yes.
I think
stick me as PM.
Well, maybe. Well, although some of our ex-energy company colleagues may not be quite as joyous about it, but I think you're right in that a lot of the metrics are there, and there is private financing, but the private financing, the business case has to be there, and there are definitely harder to reach cases with EV charging infrastructure, be that public, but definitely for fleets, with network upgrade costs that aren't working at the moment.
No.
And if it could be credit towards your energy company obligation, or even that eco funding that you were talking about, that £500 million a year, which is spent, why not have an EV element to that?
And I think there's and if I'm not saying this should be sort of directed towards energy companies, but if that was directed towards me, if I was E.ON or Centrica, I would be thinking, okay, right, if I've got to put a £500, £600 charging point on somebody's house, fine, it's going to cost me that, but it's like a smart meter. But you're in then, and you've got an opportunity then to sell them a time of use tariff, which would then help decarbonise that customer's transport. I think I can't wait for people to shoot holes in this, actually. So, but I don't know.
Well, I'm thinking, because
let's get it out there.
Yeah. One of the big challenges has always been that energy companies on the domestic side aren't allowed to lock people in, so which makes it very difficult for them to offer finance products. But maybe the market has moved on. We're seeing a lot of turbulence at the moment in the energy market, and switching has virtually ground to a halt. So maybe it is time to do something different. So unfortunately, Darren, that is about all we've got time for. It has been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Absolutely brilliant.
Thank you to Zaptech for joining GreenFleet Talks, and thank you for watching. Please tune in to GF365 again soon.